Welcome to the Healthcare Workforce Podcast, brought to you by Espirita Workforce Solutions. In this series, we're talking to the most influential, agile and diverse leaders across the healthcare industry. We'll get an insight into their unique stories and hear their opinions on the future of health and care, both in the UK and beyond. This week, we're talking to Heather Tierney-Moore, a respected leader at organisational, system and even policy level. Heather has never shied away from a challenge or an opportunity. What she describes as a transformational leadership programme early on in her role as a nurse was the inspiration for a stellar career into healthcare leadership. From becoming one of the very first Macmillan breast cancer nurses in the country to a 10-year term as Chief Executive of Lancashire Care Foundation Trust, her career has been groundbreaking, and her dedication to the healthcare industry resulted in an OBE awarded to her by Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. Heather, thank you so much for joining us. Your career has been varied, but your path seems quite intentional. Where did it all start for you?
So my mother was a nurse and my father was a scientist. And I went to the kind of school where you would do medicine, law, or study the classics. And so it was always in my mind that I would be a doctor. And I went to medical school and I hated it. And it really wasn't right for me. So I went into nursing. And as soon as I went in, it was like everything clicked. And I thought, this is right for me. And I think it was really about being able to be in a position to kind of care and support people rather than thinking of them as a set of diagnoses that needed fixing. I was one of the first Macmillan breast cancer nurses in the country and set a service up completely designed around women and their families. And you know, these days we would describe that as person-centered transformation of care. We didn't know what it was called when I was doing it in the late 80s. But whilst I was doing that, I was given the opportunity to go on a leadership programme that was designed for clinicians who were thinking of moving into management. And it was run by a couple of very senior nurse leaders in the region. And again, really groundbreaking at the time. So this was the late 80s, just early 90s. And it was a bespoke programme that they'd put together, which was as much about understanding yourself as it was about the kind of leaders that you needed to be. So it wasn't, I mean, we did learn about finance and spreadsheets and things, but actually it was much more about understanding your behaviour, your impact, your way of thinking, and what that meant for you as a leader. And it was transformational, very genuinely.
And it's this that seems to have really set off the spark in your career, because your first senior appointment came very shortly after that.
I got my first director of nursing post at the age of 36. Having only qualified as a nurse at the age of 24. So within 12 years, I'd become a director of nursing of a district general hospital. And even though it was absolutely what I wanted, I can remember feeling absolutely terrified because of the weight of the responsibility of, oh my God, what have I done? And a very good friend of mine came to work with me. And I was trying to describe to her some of the challenges I was dealing with in terms of leading the team. And she said, well, you know what the problem is, don't you? So I said, what? She said, you're frightening them all to death. She said, and it's because, she said, I know you. She said, and I know the way you're behaving is because you are terrified. But that makes you really scary because you're like the ice maiden. You're trying to be absolutely in control of everything. You're not allowing any vulnerability to show. She said, and you're scaring them to death. She said, whereas if it, and I said, but I'm lovely. And she went, yeah, of course you're lovely. She said, but they don't know that. So it was really, really insightful in terms of understanding your own sense of self and the impact that has on other people. I was there for a couple of years and did a lot of transformation work. It was a hospital with a lot of problems, and the problems stemmed from poor leadership, interestingly. So people would talk about how poor the care was, but actually it came from the top. Putting in good leadership, we achieved a huge amount in a couple of 2 or 3 years. And then I went back to Sheffield, which is where I'd been previously, to the Northern General Hospital as their chief nurse, at a time when the 2 big hospitals in Sheffield were talking about a merger. And I remember thinking, oh, that's a bit of a risky job to go for, because if there's a merger and then there'll only be one job, and that it might not be me. But I thought, do you know what? You just have to do these things sometimes and take some risks. And it was one of the things I'd learned on that leadership program, was that actually I didn't take risks prior to that, because what I said was I like really challenging, risky, interesting environments. And the very astute person on the program said, no, you don't. What you do is you manage out the risk to such an extent that by the time you step forward, there's no risk at all. They said, if you really want to be challenged, you need to have the courage to step into things that you can't manage. And that's always stuck with me in terms, and particularly in my later career, dealing with such levels of ambiguity and change. Actually, you need to be very comfortable with not being able to control things, not being able to manage everything, but find your way through it.
And that risk ultimately paid off. The merger happened and you got the job as chief nurse at Sheffield Teaching Hospitals, which was one of the biggest acute hospitals in the country at the time.
And I can remember talking to my colleagues, who were mostly men, who were very excited about how big we were. And I said, this is just such a boy thing, I said, for me, it's a worry that we've got so many staff and such a big budget, but you're clearly excited about this. So funny. Anyway, whilst I was there, again, had a fantastic opportunity to work at national level. So worked with the then new Blair government, helping them think about the first 10-year NHS modernisation plan. And again, fascinating experience of working so close to government. And it was the first time that government had brought people in from the front line. I mean, I was a director, but, actually from service, rather than relying on civil servants to advise them on policy. And it was, again, it would be normal now, but it absolutely wasn't then.
Your next career move was a job in Scotland, but you were soon to come back closer to home in a very different role, maybe one of the biggest risks of your journey so far.
So I stayed in Edinburgh for 3 years. And at that time, my mother had dementia, and I was convinced that she would deteriorate very quickly and wouldn't recognise the fact that I wasn't around. Anyway, bless her, she didn't. So I was driving up and down the motorway back to Manchester area a lot to see her. So then when I got a phone call from a headhunter saying, oh, we've got a job in Lancashire as a mental health chief exec, would you be interested? I initially said, no. I've never wanted to be a chief exec. It's far too hard. I like doing the things I like doing, which is why I'm in the world of nursing. But anyway, they kept nagging at me, and I thought, well, it would fit with mummy and all of that. So I agreed and I got it. Ironically, my mum died before I got there, but she would have said, well, you'd be far too busy anyway, pet, to be worrying about me. So, but I loved it. And it was the right, it took me a long time to get there, but it was right for me when I did it. And I wouldn't have wanted to try and get there sooner. So it's now 4 years ago, I decided I needed some sleep because working as a chief exec of a big and complex mental health organisation is more than 24 hours job. So, and I decided I wanted a portfolio career. And I wanted that structured around working with people or organisations who were trying to work with the NHS and or social care, rather than going back into the thick of it and sitting round the same tables but just in a different chair. And I think that was a very smart move. So I'd been a trustee for a big social care charity for 5 years whilst I was doing my chief exec role. So I'd had that experience, and I was lucky that I got appointed as the clinical and NHS non-executive for NHS supply chain as a non-executive. And I've been there now coming up for 5 years, well, 4.5 years, and I'm now chairman of NHS supply chain, which is just a little 4.5 billion turnover organisation that buys and delivers stuff that the NHS needs. So that's what I do. And then on Fridays, Saturdays and Sundays, I spend time with my dogs and my husband and the countryside, and have a bit more balance and get some sleep.
To what extent do you think your leadership style has been influenced by your career in health and care?
I don't think my leadership is sort of specific to health, but it's the level of authenticity and value-based leadership is really, really important in health. There may be sectors where that kind of doesn't matter. I would argue that it still does, because he's still leading people, and people are people, whether they have got nursing qualifications or they work in heavy industry. They're still people. But for me, that kind of value-based, authentic leadership is fundamental.
What would you say has been your biggest lesson on your journey so far?
I think that probably some of the hardest lessons are to learn to have resilience and retain vulnerability and humility. Because people talk a lot about resilience, but if in the wrong context, that can just make people hard, because you to remain that resilient and to keep taking the punches, that's when people start to put the shells around them. And that very much links to that work around compassion, in terms of, to be compassionate, you have to have a level of vulnerability and deep empathy. And this is when people are in very difficult, challenging environments and are not supported. That's the bit they lose. And that's when you get into compassion fatigue. And so learning how to maintain that on a personal level as a leader, I think is it's a hard lesson to learn, but it's important for you.
As we celebrate its 75th year, what would you say the health service needs now more than ever?
Well, I mean, this may sound a bit trite, but I think more than ever it needs leadership. Leadership is a state of mind, not a position. So everybody who works within the NHS can offer leadership. And so I think we need now for people to be, not to be reckless, but to be bold and to do things differently, and not take 3 years for every transformation project to even get started,
And finally, what advice do you have for the future leaders of healthcare?
So first of all, I would say, notwithstanding all its difficulties, it is an amazing organisation to be part of, and it's given me a phenomenal career. I would also say that I wasn't always this wise. So when I was 21, starting as a student nurse, if you'd said to me, this is where you'll end up and you'll have all of this wisdom and experience and knowledge and be really kind of comfortable in your own skin and all of that, I would have laughed. You also need to take some responsibility for your own journey. I've always said to people, if you always wait to be asked, what you'll do is you become very good at waiting. Senior people are often looking for people to take on projects, to do take on responsibilities, to do other things. And if they don't know about you, they're not going to find you. So think about how you get yourself on that list of people who are eager for opportunity and are prepared to take a few chances.
Heather Tierney-Moore, thank you very much for talking to us. Thank you for listening to the Healthcare Workforce Podcast, brought to you by Espirita Workforce Solutions. To hear more in our series of conversations with healthcare leaders, or for more healthcare workforce content, please subscribe to our channel, connect with us on LinkedIn, or visit espirita.co.uk. If you'd like to be featured on this podcast, or if you'd like to recommend someone to speak with us, just drop us a message at letstalk@espirita.co.uk.